আপনারা দেখছেন টকিং পয়েন্ট।
Welcome back. Today in our studio we have got Dr. Charles Tannock. He is MEP from London, and we were talking about Bangladesh, and Dr. Charles is very much into Bangladeshi politics, and he is also a member of the Executive Committee of Conservative Friends of Bangladesh. So Bangladesh and Bangladesh's rule in establishing democracy in South Asia, a young nation with a lot of problems and a lot of achievements. Dr. Charles, we were talking about Bangladesh's achievements, and you were saying that it has a young population with a lot of ideas, the people, there's a robust democracy. But how do we go beyond that? I mean, we need economic achievements. We need help from a lot of friends.
Well, what you do need, of course, is foreign direct investment, and you do need to liberalize your economy. Traditionally, it was a very protected economy, and I strongly believe that the way ahead for Bangladesh is to have a deregulated economy whereby the red tape and the bureaucracy are chipped away, and you allow a competitive market for global capital, particularly Japanese who are very happy to invest. There'll be money probably coming from the Gulf states, from the Arab world, where they can see Bangladesh as a way of developing a manufacturing base where you have a lot of skilled labor, a lot of highly educated engineers who can then manufacture to export in the region, particularly to India and possibly to China. And I think that the way for that to happen is that the SAARC, the South Asia Council, Regional Cooperation Council, needs to push the agenda of a South Asia Free Trade Agreement. This is still a dream, partly because Pakistan has blocked it for decades over Kashmir. But I think that ultimately you need to look slightly to the European Union, where the single market has been a great driver for prosperity in Central and Eastern European countries. You know, countries like Slovakia, Poland, these new members of the European Union, accessing our market, having a cheaper labor force, educated labor force, where a lot of capital has gone in there and invested and opened factories making motor cars and what have you to export to the bigger markets of Western Europe. That's been a very successful model, I think. And I think that Bangladesh, although of course you have a very large population base, you do need to trade with your neighbors, in particular with India, which is why, as I was saying, this rapprochement between the BNP, led by Khaleda Zia on her trip now to Delhi, I think is a very good thing. There should be all-party consensus between both Awami League and the BNP that better relations with India must be a top priority.
Awami League and BNP, they are all called the joint, like conservatives and the liberals. See, so they are not just one party, but they are an amalgam of 14
a broad spectrum of views.
Yes. So they represent, there are Islamists on both the sides. See.
Sure.
There are seculars on both the sides.
Sure.
See. So we have that problem, and if everybody can come to the platform and agree on that, then that will be the day we will progress. See.
Well, that's obviously a matter that only you can resolve internally, but you know, if I can give any advice to Bangladeshi politicians, is that you have to set aside historical views and the fact that, you know, India is a majority Hindu country, and think more about the prosperity of the people ultimately, rather than the religious divides between Islam and Hinduism. And remember that, you know, West Bengal, you know, we speak the same language, have a lot in common. A lot of business could be done across the border. And what needs to be done, of course, is safety and security at the border, because there has been killing and sniper fire and what have you. That's unacceptable.
Particularly on the border. Yes.
On the border, absolutely.
Well, sometimes the language does not help, see, because remember, last time Manmohan Singh was there in Bangladesh, see, and we were hoping that there will be agreements of sharing the water. And because of something went wrong in Calcutta, that agreement was not signed, you see. So the language
there was blockage by the West Bengali government. Well, the communists, of course, are out of power now, so things might improve.
Might improve, yes, I see. You were saying that you met one of the former prime ministers of Bangladesh, Barrister Maudud. How did the meeting go?
It was very interesting to talk to him because he came to me as a friend of Bangladesh because he's very senior in the BNP and of course they are threatening as a party to boycott the elections as a result of the...
Which is not very far away.
Which is not very, very far away, next year, as a result of the suspension or the repeal of the caretaker government concept, which is a uniquely Bangladeshi solution to try and stop governments using the incumbent powers, the administrative resources, to help them win an election and manipulate the results and so on. I can understand why it was done, but obviously, from the point of view of a Western politician, there's nowhere else in the world that does that. So it's very hard to justify it in our eyes. But he says that in Bangladesh it's absolutely essential and the BNP will not participate because they reckon the elections will be fraudulent. So I took on board this message. I put down a question to Cathy Ashton, who's the High Representative, the British Commissioner. She's the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. And I'm waiting for the answer because something needs to be done to try and have perhaps the EU or the United States of America to mediate somehow between the two parties so they come to some agreement as to what would be an acceptable compromise package which will give them confidence enough for the BNP to participate. Because clearly if the BNP don't participate and they boycott the elections, that will delegitimize the result and it will make Bangladesh very unstable. And it's not good for Bangladeshi democracy or prosperity if we have this kind of political chaos around the time of the elections. So I'm hoping and praying that regional powers and other international honest brokers could get stuck in there, try and knock a few heads together, as it were, to use the phrase, and make them agree on something which they will all sign up to participating, because it's such a valuable thing.
Caretaker government or no?
Yeah,
no
caretaker government, or if there's no caretaker government, at the very least that the incumbent government is very carefully scrutinized by international observers. They don't do anything untoward. They have a long-term election observation mission. I don't know what the minimum set standards required would be for the BNP to be satisfied. Maybe they insist on this idea of advisors and non-political appointees to run the government for 6 months or whatever. But it's a very strange idea for us in the West. But on the other hand, I understand there's been such a history of military government and abuse of power that something has to be done. So I'm hoping that there may be some interest in Brussels and amongst the member states, particularly the United Kingdom, of course, which has a strong link, both historical but also because of the Bangladeshi community here, that we will try and support democracy and next parliamentary elections.
But democracy comes in various shapes and sizes. I mean, no matter how much we wish, we can't have the House of Commons style and that kind of trust that we still don't have. So there's a bit of suspicion between the parties, and that is why this demand for caretaker governments. There are fears that the administration has been politicized, the police has been politicized, and that is why this demand...
Well, that's wrong, frankly. I mean, you need to have a cadre of civil servants, military commanders, police commanders, which are obedient to whoever's in government, but don't themselves get involved with the political process. And that's the only way to have continuity between different governments.
That is possibly a disadvantage of being a very robust political country. Everybody is very much interested and politically mature to take part and give his opinion and take sides. That is one of the disadvantages, I think. But economically, we are progressing, and as I was telling you, that recently Honda Motor Company, they are going to establish a manufacturing plant of Honda motorcycles. And they have one in China, but they want to have an additional one, and this is China plus one policy. And so in long term, we will be producing Honda cars in Bangladesh. And because of, as you said, that because of the larger market in India and the labor being cheap.
It makes sense.
It makes sense, and we will definitely achieve that. How we sort of deviated from the European Parliament, But let's go back to European Parliament, because I'm always amused by this. What are the achievements of European Parliament as such?
Well, I mean, funnily enough, quite a lot. There have been a number of legal projects like REACH, which was, I remember 5 years ago, which was about the regulation of chemicals, where the member states couldn't agree. And actually the European Parliament eventually came up with a bit of legislation which everybody's accepted. And it's actually worked quite well. So that's just a sort of a legislative example of where we've done quite a lot. But interestingly enough, I mean, on trade agreements at the moment, there's a big battle going on over whether or not we should have a trade agreement with, say, Colombia, because the left there are opposing it, and the member states want it. Last week there was a huge debate in Strasbourg where the member states all agreed, but it became a football on the issue of trading of pharmaceutical products manufactured in Israel, to be able to export them safely and cheaper products as well to the European Union. And this became a very big debating point. And again, the Parliament eventually said yes, but it was very, very touch and go. So I think it's a very useful democratic open chamber where things are no longer done just behind closed doors. It really came back to me 2 years ago when there was a thing called SWIFT. Now, your viewers won't know what SWIFT is. It's actually a system of communicating and sending money internationally from banks. And the servers for this are in Europe. And the Americans wanted to have access to the SWIFT data in the fight against terrorism, and they thought they could sew it all up by just talking to London, Berlin, Paris and Rome. The legislation will be passed allowing the Americans, particularly the access to all the transactions on a fishing expedition from European bank accounts, sending money globally through the SWIFT system of monetary exchange. And it was a huge wake-up call when somebody stood up in the European Parliament and said, would the US Congress allow unfettered access to European police or law enforcement agencies on the movement of American citizens moving their money around the world? Of course, the answer was no. So I knew immediately that that piece of legislation was going to fall, even though we, the Conservatives, were going to support it. But I knew that in terms of democracy and scrutiny, the Americans would try to stitch it up. And the bill fell, the directive fell, and we had the powers to do this. The Americans didn't even realize the European Parliament had the power after the Lisbon Treaty 3 years ago to vote against this. So all of a sudden, Joe Biden was sent on a quick mission a month later to the European Parliament to say nice things about us. The US ambassador started trying to court us and find out who the MEPs were for the UK and what we did. And the US government, it was a wake-up call because they realized that there are now powers which have gone to the European Parliament which before didn't exist. And so I actually think that if you talk about there being a democratic deficit in the European Union, which is the largest economic bloc in the world, the GDP of the EU taken together is bigger than the United States with 510 million people now. You do need to have one forum where citizens can let off their steam through their representatives. All parties are represented from, bizarrely you get the far right, the far left, you get a much wider spectrum.
How many MEPs do we have?
72 for the United Kingdom and 8 in London.
Yep.
And the good thing about the way it works as well, in London there are 3 Conservatives, 2 Labour, 1 Independent, UKIP, 1 Liberal, 1 Green. Also it means that, of course, citizens can write to an MEP of their political choice. If they want, they can also write to an MEP with expertise on that particular issue because they sit on the relevant committee. So on foreign policy issues, on human rights, people often write to me. If it's a matter to do with women's rights, they will write to my colleague Marina Yiannakadakis or Mary Honeyball from the Labour Party because they sit on the Women's Committee. So it gives the electorate quite a lot of choice, actually, this system. It's not great if you wanted to form a government. It wouldn't work for the House of Commons, but it does work where you're trying to build bridges and consensus. It doesn't have the kind of adversarial approach of the House of Commons where it's government and opposition. It's more about finding consensus so that the laws that are passed and that are shaped by the Parliament can be broadly acceptable across the entire European Union of 27 countries, 500 million people.
Oh, great. Dr. Charles Tannock will go for a break, and when we come back, viewers, we'll talk again about European Council and how it works and how MEPs are elected. That's a fascination that many people have. They want to represent their country overseas, but that's not very far in Europe. Thank you. Don't go away.
আপনারা দেখছেন টকিং পয়েন্ট।